Hello YouTube, Poopslag here, and this is TurboFat, an open source video game I'm developing using the Godot engine. You can find a link to the source in the description below. And this month I was working on fleshing out the character appearance, making them look and behave a little different. You can see this little guy, they can run around in the overworld. That guy yawned a little if you noticed that. And if you zoom in, you can see their faces look a little different. They have things like noses and cheek poofs. So yeah, that was the kind of stuff I was doing. Their shadows, I'll go into it more. Why don't I show you? So I already sort of had shadows on the belly, arms, and legs, but as the creature got bigger, the shadows didn't change at all, making it look like their body was just dark for no reason. So the new version has more directed shadows. So you can see there's a shadow underneath their head, and their arms and legs, and a shadow for the bottom of their belly. And it changes as the creature goes bigger. So let me show you how I did that. So as the creature grows, their belly is already drawn dynamically using a curve, and I figured I could reuse that logic for drawing the shadows beneath their arms and head. Just interpolate between a few different shadow shapes for each creature size. Then render all those shadows to a viewport texture, and then apply that rendered texture to the belly using a shader. And that mostly worked. I store those curve definitions in some dictionaries, which are exported to the editor as variables, and then I also created a tool so I can easily manipulate these curves in the editor. I encountered some problems when I tried to apply the shadows to the creature's belly using a shader, because the creature's belly is drawn using a custom Path2D draw command, and you can't apply shaders to arbitrarily drawn shapes in Godot. They have to be textures. This doesn't seem to be a limitation of Godot as much as some sort of a limitation with shaders or hardware acceleration. But in any case, the workaround is pretty simple. I just needed to render the creature's belly to a viewport container first, and then I could apply a shader to the viewport container instead of to the belly directly. I wanted the creatures to have colored bellies which would also grow as the creature grew, so I used the same technique for the colored bellies as I did for the shadows. They're both merged in using the same shader. There's a scene in Monty Python's The Meaning of Life where a person eats more and more food until they get ridiculously huge, and then they're offered a wafer thin mint, and then something very bad happens. And I wanted to capture the same sort of vibe in my game, where as you feed creatures, they get happier and happier until there's sort of a tipping point where they're less happy, and then they start looking very anxious and sad. So to make the creatures look more expressive as you fed them, I reused some of the logic from the chat emotes I'd already developed. Making them look happy was easy enough. I already had some happy emotes. So I made their eyes squint, and I made their cheeks blush, and I made their heads bob up and down, and that part was pretty easy. As the creature got uncomfortably big, though, I not only wanted their expression to change to an anxious one, but I also wanted them to look hot and sweaty. So to do this, I not only added some flop sweat coming off their forehead, but some body sweat in the form of droplets which appear on their body. And I accomplished this using Godot's Particles 2D engine. There's a shape which defines the area where these particles can appear, and that shape moves and grows as the creature gets bigger. It was all actually pretty easy. I thought I was going to have to write my own logic for calculating a random position in an oval to draw a particle. You basically just give the Particles 2D an oval shape where it can render particles, and it'll just put them wherever. So with all that done, here's the result. You can see the creature when they start to eat, and they get happy. And then they get less happy. And then they get sad. And then they sort of want to die. Don't worry, I'll be keeping things light. Nothing terrible is going to happen. Probably. I don't know yet. So when the creatures are just sitting there, I wanted them to have a few idle animations where they might look over their shoulder or yawn or blink their eyes or take a nap or something like that. So I created this idle timer class, and then every 20 seconds or so when the timer expires, it emits a signal that an idle animation should start. This signal is listened for by several animation players, each of which can optionally define how to animate each of these idle animations. So for example, the mouth animation player defines how to yawn, but the ear animation player does not define how to yawn. It defines things like how to wiggle the ears. So this feels extensible because some idle animations do involve multiple body parts. Like when you yawn, you might also close your eyes and things like that. So I also made some changes to how the pieces move. First of all, there's the concept of a floor kick. This was already implemented. Basically, if the piece rotates so that it bumps into the floor, it ends up in the air again. And you don't get an infinite number of these, otherwise you could spin the piece forever. But it used to be that once you used your last floor kick, it would continue trying to kick the piece in other directions, which could incentivize the player to use their last floor kick just to get the piece to rotate where they wanted. And that was kind of dumb. So now once you use your last floor kick, that's it. It won't kick anymore. I also redid the U piece's rotation rules. It used to pivot around its midsection, sort of like an L piece, but now it pivots around its gap. And the reason I made this change was that the old rotation rules made it difficult to get the piece to climb up on the side of the playfield, which is necessary in TurboFat to set up snack boxes, but it wouldn't rotate up there, and it wasn't even something I could fix with a piece kick, because no kick was necessary in that situation. So now instead it pivots around the gap, which makes the piece easier to manipulate up there. You used to be able to perform a technique called a squish drop, where if you soft drop the piece and hold hard drop, it would do a squish move and a drop at the same time. The piece would just get rocketed to the bottom. Except it wasn't very consistent, because if there was a small gap, it would stop. So now squish drop is its own little thing. It gets some special treatment and some special logic, so it always goes to the bottom, always locks the piece instantly. So the reason I highlighted this stuff is not necessarily because I expect you guys to care about the nitty-gritty of floor kicks and piece kicks and squish moves and drops and timing and stuff, but more just to highlight that these are the kinds of problems I wouldn't have caught unless I was playing my own game a lot. And I think that's really important when you're developing a game, especially as a solo developer. You need to really love your game enough to want to sit down and play it just to relax. Not just to think like, oh, I need to test my game, but you want to get good enough at your game where you realize the difference between a 5-frame window and a 7-frame window for a trick, or when some pieces rotate a certain way but the other pieces don't seem quite consistent with it, and things like that. Things that only get on your nerve once you have a lot of experience at your own game. You really got to play your own game, and you got to play it a lot. If you don't think it's fun, nobody else will. So after some bad experiences playing Outer Wilds on the PS4, rolling backup saves are always in the back of my mind. Outer Wilds was a fantastic game, but the PS4 version not only crashed every 2 hours, but when it crashed, it deleted all of your save data and made you start the entire game over, deleting everything in your encyclopedia and making it impossible to get certain achievements. So I always knew this was something I'd want to set up eventually. But then in the middle of July, I had a thunderstorm which made the power blink off and on while I was playing the game. And when I turned my computer back on, all my files were fine, except for that one TurboFat save file. Probably because I was playing the game at the time and it was the last file my hard drive touched. I don't know, but whatever it was hilarious that it just torched that file. It almost felt like a sign like, yeah, you got to take care of rolling backup saves. This would suck if someone else lost all their high scores and stuff. So one way to do this would just be to say every time you go to save, if it's been an hour since your last backup, you copy the current save file to a backup file or something. But you don't just want to have one backup file in case you screwed up something more than an hour ago. But you also don't want to have rolling backups that stretch on for a week, because a week's worth of hourly backups would be like, 100, 200 save files? So that's crazy. I wanted a compromise, which would let people go back up to a week, but which wouldn't have more than a few save files. So here's the scheme I came up with. The first time the game goes to save, it also copies the current save file to what I'll call a future hourly backup. The next time it goes to save, it sees that that future hourly backup file already exists, so it leaves it alone until that file gets over an hour old. And once that file is an hour old, then it moves it aside, and that becomes the hourly backup. It's a backup file that's over an hour old. And then it'll also copy the current save file to create a new future hourly backup. So the result is that you always have the current save file, a backup that's not yet an hour old, and a backup that's more than an hour old. I did the same scheme for daily backups and weekly backups, and the result is you can roll back an hour a day or a week, and you only have 7 save files. It doesn't seem like a huge price to pay, given the benefits. So on startup, if the game detects it can't load your current save file, it just goes to older and older backups until it finds when it can load, and it shows you a little window with a little apology and telling you what's going on and where you can find your old save data in case you're a computer savvy type who might want to actually dig into the problem or something. So yeah, there it is. I'm really happy with it. So one other tweak I wanted to make is that when you play the game on a smartphone, the game has a fixed aspect ratio, so it doesn't always take up the entire phone's screen, but I wanted the controls to always be in the corners, even if the game didn't take up the whole screen. That way the player's thumbs could be in a comfortable position. So Godot has a setting to keep your aspect ratio consistent, but it does that by adding black bars on the side, and you have no control over the content of those black bars. You can't put anything in them or change how they look or whatever. So to get my mobile controls over there, I changed the stretch aspect setting from keep to expand, and then I had to tweak a few of my UI elements so that the touchscreen controls would stretch out to the sides, but the rest of the game wouldn't. In the future, this will also help me get rid of those black bars if I want to fill them with a background, or even have some screens stretched to fill out the sides. We'll see. So about halfway through the month, I tweeted a little work in progress of how the month was going so far, and I got some nice feedback where someone suggested that the game was fun, but they might like a ghost piece mechanic similar to other games of its type. And I thought that ghost piece was pretty unnecessary given that the well is so narrow and the pieces are so big. It was pretty unlikely that the pieces would end up in the wrong place. At least I never had that problem. But I realized it was a pretty easy thing to add, and it would make the game a lot more friendly to casual players, so I went ahead and added it. So at first I thought I could have a custom node responsible for drawing a shadow piece, but then I realized the pieces in the playfield already have drop shadows, so why not just modify that shadow logic to draw a shadow where the piece is going to land and have a literal shadow piece? So yeah, every time the piece moves or rotates, we update this ghost shadow offset property. And that ghost shadow offset property says, in addition to drawing this piece's shadows where they're supposed to be right behind the piece, also draw a second copy of the shadows 6 tiles lower or 10 tiles lower or however far. And then in the shadow drawing logic, it checks, well, if that ghost shadow offset property is set, draw a second copy of the shadows. And then there's a tiny bit of extra logic also for overlapping the two shadows in the case where the piece is really close to the bottom of the screen. But overall, it was pretty simple and elegant to implement. There's also 3 new songs added to the soundtrack, one for the overworld, another one for the puzzle section, and one specific to the tutorial. As usual, they all sound great, and I'm really excited about how the soundtrack is shaping up. Overweight creatures are no longer restricted to puzzle mode, and can now also appear on the overworld. The creatures can run around, and the more weight they gain, the slower they move. When they're skinny, you can see they scamper around on their hands and feet. And once they gain a little weight, they prefer to run on 2 legs. If they gain even more weight, they're restricted to walking, and eventually they get to where their legs can't touch the ground. I didn't know what to do here, but I think what I came up with is pretty hilarious. I couldn't stop laughing when I first animated this. It just looks so goofy. I also added a variety of noses and little cheek puffs to increase the amount of variety in the creatures. Right now, the noses look a little bit silly with the creatures because most of them have little beaky mouths and things that protrude, so having the nose is sort of redundant and looks a little bad. But in the end, I think the different creatures are going to not just be bugs, but they'll be like lions and bears and aliens and monsters and whatever, and I think noses will look good on a lot of them. Overall, though, it'll be up to the players to make creatures that look reasonable, so I'm going to try not to constrain too much. If people want to make something that looks silly, that's on them, and maybe silly is good, who knows. Yeah, so that's what I finished for this month. Overall, my goal is to get the creatures looking good, and I'm really happy with how they're starting to look, but that's only like a third of what I wanted to get done for these 2 months. And the other pieces that are left for the upcoming month are getting the creature editor in place to where someone can start up the game, and then within the game, design their own little monster that they get to play as or that they get to see in the overworld. So that's a big step. And the other piece is, as far as the dialogue engine is pretty good, but there's no logic for saying like, oh, this creature has talked to the player before, so they'll say something different. So that's half of it. And also the idea of maybe having some generated dialogue using something like Tracery or something where it might not know exactly what this character is going to say, but it knows he likes basketball, so he'll say like, hey, let's go play, basketball, that sort of thing. So that's sort of what I have planned for next month. Wish me luck. It's going to be a lot. See you guys next month.